On a September night in 1998, at a party thrown during New York Fashion Week at a Manhattan club called the Kit Kat Club, a 52-year-old real estate developer walked over to a 28-year-old Slovenian model and asked for her phone number. He had arrived that evening with a date. The model noticed the date, and so she said no. She would not give him her number. Instead, she asked for his. She wanted to see, she explained years later, which number he would leave her. If he gave her the office line, she would know she was one of a rotation. If he gave her the private line, the home line, she would know the interest was real. He gave her every number he had. She waited several days before dialing any of them. The developer was Donald Trump. The model was Melania Trump, who by then had smoothed her name into Melania Naus, and who would, 7 years later, stand in an Episcopal church in Palm Beach and become the third Mrs. Trump, and who would, 11 years after that, become the First Lady of the United States. We have told ourselves 2 stories about this marriage, and both of them are lazy. The first story says she is a trophy, a transaction, a beautiful acquisition. The second story says she is a captive, a woman frozen inside a gilded cage, blinking messages to us through sunglasses. But there is a third reading, and it begins with that phone number. It begins with a woman who, in the first 60 seconds of the most consequential relationship of her life, declined the standard terms and drafted her own. What if this was never a fairy tale and never a hostage crisis, but something rarer in American public life? A marriage negotiated in the open, clause by clause, by 2 people who understood exactly what they were signing? There is one clause in this arrangement that almost everyone misreads, and I will come back to it near the end, because the way we misread it says more about us than about her. Stay with me. The record is stranger than the myth. Here is what we are going to walk through together. First, the phone number itself, and why that small refusal at the Kit Kat Club was not flirtation but due diligence. Second, the prenuptial architecture of the Trump marriages, a paper trail that runs back to 1977, and a first wife named Ivana who did not want to sign. Third, the visa, a federal immigration category so exclusive it is nicknamed the Einstein visa, granted to Melania Naus in 2001, and what that classification actually requires. Fourth, the 5 months in 2017 when the new First Lady of the United States simply declined to move to Washington, and what reporters covering the East Wing believed those months were really 4. And fifth, the mirror, the uncomfortable part, the reason her contract is only a notarized version of the contract inside every American marriage, including one clause the federal government itself writes into yours, whether you have read it or not. A word on method before we begin. Behind the portrait does not claim to see inside anyone's marriage. No one outside a marriage ever holds the full ledger. And this is history and public record, not personal or legal advice. What we do is read the paperwork. A marriage leaves behind the filings, the classifications, the dates, the biographies. She was born Melania Trump on the 26th of April, 1970, in Novo Mesto, in what was then socialist Yugoslavia and is now Slovenia. And she was raised in the small industrial town of Sevnica, on the banks of the Sava River, a town of a few thousand people known mostly for a furniture factory, a textile plant, and a hilltop castle. Her father, Victor, managed and sold cars, and by the standards of Tito's Yugoslavia, the family did well enough for Victor to drive a Mercedes and a Maserati in a country where most people waited years for a Zastava. Her mother, Amalaja, worked as a pattern maker at Jutranjka, a factory that made children's clothing, which means Melania grew up in a household where a woman earned her living by taking something shapeless and cutting it precisely to specification. Amalaja brought sketches home. She sewed clothes for her daughters that made them, by the accounts of Sevnica neighbors, the best-dressed girls in town, and she took Melania and her older sister Inez to fashion shows the factory staged. It is hard not to notice that. The daughter would spend her whole life doing a version of the same work, taking the shapeless material of circumstance and cutting it exactly to pattern. The formal beginning came in January of 1987, when a Slovenian fashion photographer named Stane Jerko spotted a 16-year-old girl standing against a railing outside a fashion show in Ljubljana, waiting for a friend, and asked if she had ever considered modeling. He shot her first portfolio. 5 years later, in 1992, she placed second in a Look of the Year contest run by the Slovenian magazine Jana, a competition that promised international modeling contracts to its top 3 finishers. In between, she had enrolled at the University of Ljubljana to study architecture and design, and she left after a year, a decision her critics would later throw at her, and which, read coldly, was simply the correct trade. Architecture school is a bet on a salary in your 30s. A modeling contract at 22 is capital now and depreciating. She took the contract. The trajectory from there is the standard one for a beautiful girl from a small European country at the end of the Cold War. First Ljubljana, then Milan and Paris. The apartment shares, the castings, the go-sees, the slow accumulation of a portfolio. And she was by every account a disciplined, punctual, unscandalous worker in an industry not famous for any of those qualities. She did not drink. She did not do the club circuit for pleasure. Colleagues from those years describe a woman who treated her face as an asset under management. In 1996, she reached New York, sponsored into the American market by the modeling agent Paolo Zampoli, who ran a boutique agency called Ide Models, and who liked to say he brought only a handful of girls to America each year. She shared an apartment near Union Square with a photographer named Matthew Atanian, who later recalled a roommate who ate 7 vegetables and fruits a day, did leg weights in the living room, and stayed home saving money while other models went out. Her American work accumulated the way her European work had, steadily, commercially, without tabloid noise, and would eventually include a Camel cigarette billboard that hung over Times Square, and, in 2000, the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. And it was Zampoli's party at the Kit Kat Club in September of 1998, thrown during Fashion Week, where the developer with a date walked over. You know what happened with the phone number. What happened next is the part the fairy tale version skips. She did not fall into his world. She proceeded into it, deliberately, at her own pace. They dated. They appeared together. In 1999, when Trump flirted publicly with a presidential run on the Reform Party ticket, Melania appeared beside him and told the New York Times, with perfect composure, what kind of first lady she would be. Traditional, she said, like Betty Ford or Jackie Kennedy. 17 years before the election, 6 years before the wedding, the Slovenian model had already studied the role, selected her precedents, and priced the position. There was a breakup around 2000, brief, initiated, by most accounts, by him, and then a reconciliation that observers noticed happened on her terms, with her position visibly stronger afterward. In 2004, he proposed, at the Metropolitan Museum's Costume Institute Gala, with a 12-carat emerald-cut diamond from the London jeweler Graf, valued at roughly $1.5 million, a ring nobody in the room could fail to see, and when Trump later boasted to the press that he had gotten it half off, Graf publicly stated that no discount had been given, a small comic footnote in which even the engagement ring came with a dispute about terms. And on the 22nd of January, 2005, at the Church of Bethesda, by the sea in Palm Beach, Florida, Melania Naus married Donald Trump. She wore a Christian Dior gown designed by John Galliano, cut from roughly 300 feet of white duchesse satin embroidered with some 1,500 crystal rhinestones, with a 13-foot train, a dress that reportedly weighed about 50 pounds and cost in the neighborhood of $100,000. And she wore it first, before the wedding, on the cover of the February 2005 issue of Vogue, photographed by Mario Testino, because the dress, like everything else, was also a business instrument. The reception followed in Mar-a-Lago's newly built 17,000-square-foot ballroom. Billy Joel sang, and the guest list of several hundred included Barbara Walters, Rudy Giuliani, Shaquille O'Neal, and among others, a senator from New York named Hillary Clinton, and her husband, the former president. We watched that wedding as a spectacle. It was actually a closing, the signing ceremony at the end of a deal that had been in drafting for nearly 7 years. And to understand the terms, you have to understand the first Mrs. Trump, because Melania was not the first woman asked to sign. The mechanism underneath this marriage is, in plain English, the prenuptial agreement, and Donald Trump's relationship with that instrument is one of the most consistent facts of his adult life. Go back to 1977. That April, at Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan, with the celebrity pastor Norman Vincent Peale officiating, Trump married the Czech skier and model Ivana Zelníková, and before the wedding he insisted on a prenuptial agreement drafted by his mentor and fixer, the attorney Roy Cohn, the man who had taught him that every relationship in life is adversarial until papered. The record of that first marriage tells us that Ivana was initially reluctant to sign it, that she balked in particular at a clause requiring her to return gifts in the event of divorce, and that the agreement was renegotiated at least 3 times over the course of the marriage, each revision tracking her rising value to the enterprise as she ran the Plaza Hotel and helped manage Trump Castle. She signed. The marriage lasted, publicly and glamorously, through the 1980s, through Trump Tower and the Plaza and 3 children, and then it ended, detonated by a confrontation on an Aspen ski slope in December of 1989 between Ivana and a 26-year-old actress named Marla Maples, and the divorce that followed owned the front page of the New York tabloids for the better part of 1990. Ivana challenged the prenup, her lawyers arguing fraud and coercion, and the case settled in 1991 for terms generally reported at around $14 million, plus the family's Greenwich, Connecticut estate, an apartment in Trump Plaza, and $650,000 a year in support for the children, a sum that sounds enormous until you set it against the billion, plus dollars the tabloids believed the marriage might otherwise have put in play. And here is the lesson the developer took from the wreckage. The buildings were leveraged. The casinos were faltering. Atlantic City was sliding toward the bond defaults of the early 90s. The marriage was ash. The contract held. Whatever else collapsed in 1992, the paper signed in 1977, however loudly contested, did what paper is for. It converted an unbounded catastrophe into a bounded one. He married again Marla Maples in December of 1993 at the Plaza Hotel, 2 months after the birth of their daughter Tiffany, again with an agreement in place, this one reportedly capping her settlement at roughly $1 to $2 million if the marriage ended early. And when Trump filed for divorce in 1997, tabloid coverage noted the timing fell before a milestone that would have enriched her claim. Again, the terms were the terms. So by September of 1998, standing in the Kit Kat Club, Donald Trump was a man who had twice watched love fail and twice watched contracts perform. Marriage, for him, had been converted from a promise into an instrument. And the remarkable thing about Melania now is that she did not resist that conversion the way Ivana had. She appears to have understood it instantly, perhaps because she came from a pattern-maker's household, perhaps because a decade in the modeling business is itself an education in short contracts, option clauses, exclusivity terms, usage rights, and the exact cash value of appearance. A working model signs more contracts by 25 than most people sign in a lifetime. And every one of them prices her body, her time, and her image without sentiment. Legal scholars have wrestled for years with what such agreements really are. A 2021 study in the journal Philosophy of Law examined the urgency of prenuptial agreements for husbands and wives under Indonesian marriage law, and a 2025 analysis in the journal Juridica studied prenuptial agreements and the principle of balanced justice in dividing joint property under Islamic marriage law. Different countries, different faiths, the same underlying question, and notice that it is not an American question or a Trump question. It is the universal one. Is a contract signed before the vows a betrayal of the vow, or its most honest expression? Surveys by the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers have found solid majorities of divorce attorneys reporting a rise in prenup requests, driven above all by clients in their 20s and 30s. And a 2022 Harris poll found that roughly 15% of engaged and married Americans had signed one, up from about 3% a decade earlier. The generation that mocked this marriage hardest is quietly adopting its paperwork. Here is the detail. The tabloid version never sat with. The prenup was not the cold part of this marriage. The prenup was the visible part. Every marriage contains an arrangement about money, power, access, and exit. Most couples keep theirs unwritten, unexamined, and unpriced until the day it detonates in a courtroom. This couple wrote theirs down. When Melania took his number instead of giving hers, she was already operating inside that logic. She was not being coy. Now watch the pattern repeat 3 times in 3 different rooms. The first room is a federal immigration office. In 2001, 4 years before the wedding, Melania Trump was granted permanent residency in the United States under a classification the government calls alien of extraordinary ability. One category, the most exclusive employment-based visa the United States issues, reserved, in the government's own framing, for people with sustained national or international acclaim, the small class of applicants whose achievement is so documented that the country simply wants them. To qualify, an applicant must either have won a major internationally recognized award, the statute's drafters had the Nobel Prize in mind, or satisfy at least 3 of 10 regulatory criteria, things like published material about you in major media, original contributions of major significance to your field, commanding a high salary relative to others in the field, and a leading or critical role in distinguished organizations. Its nickname in immigration circles is the Einstein visa, because it is the lane built for Nobel laureates, Olympic medalists, and figures of that rank. In 2001, out of more than 1 million green cards issued by the United States, only a few thousand went through this category, and reporting by the Washington Post later established that just 5 went to applicants from Slovenia that year. Melania Trump was one of the 5. When this surfaced during her husband's presidency, immigration lawyers publicly debated whether a commercially successful model, whose resume at the time ran to runway work, catalog work, the Camel billboard, and the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, met the extraordinary ability standard, and Bruce Morrison, the former congressman who helped write the 1990 law creating the category, remarked that the standard was meant for the top of a field. Her attorney, Michael Wilds, insisted the application was legitimate, well-documented, and self-earned. But set the controversy aside and look at the structural fact, because it is the one that matters for our story. Melania secured her American status alone, on her own petition, sponsored by no husband and no fiancé, years before the marriage. She never entered this union as a dependent spouse, whose right to remain in the country flowed through her husband, which is the quiet structural weakness of thousands of international marriages, where one partner's legal existence in the country is itself a lever the other partner holds. Her passport did not need him. That is not a small thing. That is leverage, banked in advance. She became a citizen in 2006, the first naturalized citizen ever to become First Lady, and only the second First Lady born outside the United States, the first being Louisa Adams, born in London in 1775, wife of John Quincy Adams. And years later, quietly, in August of 2018, her parents, Victor and Amalia Janavs, stood in a Manhattan federal building and became American citizens through the family-based process, sponsored by their daughter, represented by the same Michael Wildes. During the very years her husband's administration was campaigning to abolish that exact category of migration under the name chain migration. When reporters pointed out the contradiction, Wildes called the criticism unfair and the process standard. It was standard. That is the point. The contract, you notice, had provisions for her side of the table too, and she executed them on schedule, in public, without apology, while the White House messaging apparatus said nothing at all. The second room is Trump Tower, in the winter and spring of 2017. Her husband had won the presidency. The removal vans did not come. For nearly 5 months, the First Lady of the United States declined to move into the White House, remaining on her own floors of Trump Tower in Manhattan with her son, Barron, while the official explanation held that she did not wish to interrupt his school year. The explanation was reasonable. Mothers everywhere nodded. It was also spectacularly expensive. The New York Police Department put the cost of securing Trump Tower at somewhere between $127,000 and $146,000 per day while the president was away, a figure city officials cited in demanding tens of millions in federal reimbursement, which means the school year explanation carried a 9-figure adjacent price tag, and she let it run anyway. But reporters covering the East Wing described something else moving beneath those months. Mary Jordan, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter at The Washington Post, interviewed more than 100 people in 3 countries for her 2020 book on the marriage, and her sourcing pointed to a belief inside the president's own circle that Melania was using the interval to revisit the financial understandings of her marriage, and specifically to secure written assurances about Barron's future standing relative to the president's 3 adult children from the first marriage. Now that the man she had married in 2005 had become something categorically more valuable and categorically more costly to be married to. Jordan's sources called it, in effect, taking care of Barron. I want to be careful here, because that account is reporting and characterization, not a document we can hold, and the First Lady's office, through her spokeswoman Stephanie Grisham, denied it flatly. We cannot verify the negotiation. What we can verify is the shape. A woman with independent status, independent leverage, and a signed agreement did not perform the expected wifely relocation on the expected schedule, held her position in her own building at extraordinary public cost, and when she finally arrived in Washington on the 11th of June 2017, with Barron enrolled for the fall at St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Maryland, a school she chose, not the Sidwell Friends of recent presidential custom, she arrived on a timetable that was unmistakably hers. The third room is public. It is every tarmac and colonnade of the next 4 years, and this is where the ordinary rules of reading a marriage fail us. The cameras caught what looked like fractures. A hand reached for and visibly flicked away on the tarmac at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv in May of 2017, a palm gently swatted on the way to Air Force One, and in June of 2018 on a visit to a facility in McAllen, Texas, holding migrant children separated from their parents, a $39 green Zara jacket with words stenciled across the back. I really don't care, do you? A garment so aggressively legible that the country spent a week translating it. Her office said it was just a jacket with no hidden message. The president tweeted that it referred to the fake news media. She herself, months later, in an interview with ABC, said it was aimed at the left-wing media and offered the sentence that may be the truest thing anyone said in those 4 years. I want to show them that I don't care. We read all of this as a marriage in ruins, but look again through the lens this episode has been grinding. She performed the ceremonial duties of the office to the letter. She planned the administration's first state dinner for President Macron of France in April 2018, famously without an outside event planner, selecting the menu, the Sèvres porcelain, the cream and gold scheme herself, and even the critics conceded the execution was flawless. She did the Christmas decorations, including the corridor of blood-red trees. The internet mocked, and she never explained. She launched an initiative for children she called Be Best in May of 2018 and staffed the entire East Wing with roughly a dozen aides when Michelle Obama's had run to more than 20, to the letter, and not one syllable further. No confessional interviews, no performed adoration, no hand-holding for the cameras that the cameras had not caught her declining. No pretense of a partnership of soulmates, no ghost-written his and hers profile in a friendly magazine. She delivered exactly what the role required and withheld everything the audience merely wanted. That is not a broken contract. That is a strictly construed one, and any lawyer will tell you the difference between breach and strict construction is the whole game. So let us now do what almost no coverage of this marriage has ever done and actually read the terms. Not a paper document which we do not possess, but the operating agreement the public record reveals, clause by clause. There are 5. Term 1, access. From the first night, contact happened on her schedule. She took the number. She placed the call days later, when the waiting had told her what she needed to know. And notice what the test was actually testing, not his interest, which was obvious, but his exclusivity and his candor, the two things a woman in her position could not afford to assume. Across 25 years, that term never lapsed. A wife who appears beside her husband when she elects to, and is genuinely, unapologetically absent when she does not. Absent from the campaign trail for months at a stretch in 2016, absent from Washington for 5 months in 2017, present, immaculate at every moment the role itself, rather than the man required. Term 2, separation of property, agreed in advance. The lesson of Ivana, learned by both parties, that a contract contested is still a contract, and a contract signed under Roy Cohn's eye in 1977 had outperformed every building in the portfolio. Whatever the Trumps owned together and apart was defined before the vows, not litigated after them, which is precisely the balanced justice function that scholars of marriage law, from that Eurydica analysis to the Indonesian study, identify as the honest work of such agreements, deciding the ending while you still like each other. Her green card in 2001, secured on her own extraordinary ability petition, her citizenship in 2006, her parents' naturalization in 2018, each secured on its own legal footing, none dependent on the marriage surviving, and each one reducing in advance the price he could ever extract for leaving or make her pay for staying. She built an exit she never had to use, which is exactly why she never had to use it. Leverage that must be exercised is weak leverage. Leverage that merely exists and is known to exist does its work silently, every day, at the breakfast table. Term 4, the child. From Baron's birth in March of 2006, the record shows a mother who fenced her son from the family spectacle with a thoroughness no other clause matched. Her own floors of the tower, her own rules, her parents installed as constant caretakers, Slovenian spoken at home so thoroughly that the president's son is fluent in it, her own timetable, up to and including delaying the White House itself, at $130,000 public dollars a day until his school year ended. And, if the East Wing reporting is right, a renegotiated instrument securing his position in the estate. Whatever else was negotiable, he was not. Term 5, performance and renegotiation. She She would execute the public role, the campaigns, the conventions, the East Wing, the Macron dinner, at the standard she herself had named back in 1999 when she invoked Betty Ford and Jackie Kennedy, and in exchange when the circumstances of the contract changed materially, as they did on election night 2016, when a rich man's wife became a head of state's wife and every cost and every exposure repriced overnight, the terms could be reopened. Material change triggering renegotiation is not cynicism. It is the most ordinary clause in commercial law. Read together. These 5 clauses describe something we do not have good language for, because our vocabulary for marriage offers only romance or ruin, soulmates or hostages, and she is neither. This is an arrangement. 2 adults built deliberately, maintained precisely, and never once pretended to each other was anything else. The pretending was left to us. Which brings me to the clause everyone misreads, the one I promised you at the start. We look at the contract and conclude, the absence of love, as if paper and feeling cannot share a house. Every clause is an admission that it might, and an agreement made in advance about how to stay or how to leave without destroying each other. The unwritten marriage is not more loving than the written one. It is only more confident, and confidence is not a virtue. It is a forecast, and half of American forecasts are wrong. There is a scholarly study of the Empress Livia, wife of Augustus, that examines how Rome effectively invented the role we now call the First Lady, a woman whose marriage was itself a public office, performed in the public sphere for the benefit of the state, whose household conduct was propaganda, whose loyalty was policy. 2,000 years ago, in other words, the world already understood that certain marriages are not private arrangements at all, but standing contracts with an audience. And every American First Lady since Martha Washington has signed that second, larger contract the moment her husband took the oath, whether she wished to or not. Melania's innovation was refusing to pretend otherwise. And before we congratulate ourselves on marrying for purer reasons, one last document. The Social Security Administration maintains entire official pages on family benefits and on benefits for spouses, setting out exactly how much a husband or wife is entitled to draw on a partner's record. A spousal benefit worth up to 50% of the worker's full retirement amount, survivor benefits, and buried a little deeper, the rule that a divorced spouse retains claims on an ex-partner's record only if the marriage lasted at least 10 years, which means the federal government has, in black and white, priced the difference between a 9-year marriage and a 10-year one. The federal government, in other words, writes financial clauses into every American marriage, yours included, with dollar figures and vesting schedules and duration thresholds, and most of us have never read a line of them. Melania Trump read hers. That is the whole scandal. That has always been the whole scandal. So return, one last time, to the Kit Kat Club, September 1998. A man with a date asks a woman for her number, and the woman says no, and takes his instead, and waits several days to call, and in that small, deliberate withholding, drafts the first clause of a marriage that would carry her from a pattern-maker's household in Sevnica to the White House. We built 2 myths around her because both were comfortable. The gold digger let us sneer, the captive let us pity. And both let us believe that our own marriages, unlike hers, are innocent of arithmetic, when the government's own paperwork says otherwise. She never asked for our sympathy, and on the evidence she has never needed it. She read the terms, she signed, she performed, and she is still there, which is more than most of the people who mocked the arrangement can say about theirs. If this kind of history interests you, the marriage beneath the myth told from the record rather than the rumor, subscribe to Behind the Portrait and tap the like button so the next viewer can find us. Next time, another negotiated union America mistook for a fairy tale. the second marriage of Jacqueline Kennedy, arranged across a lawyer's table before it ever reached a chapel. I will see you behind the portrait.